Hello, my name is Cody Leslie, and I'm going to be talking about Darwinism during the Victorian era. Let's get right to it. So, before we can talk directly about Darwinism and the evolution of theory, we need to go ahead and talk about the theories that happened before that so we can understand how it changed the ideas in the Victorian era. So, back before Darwin had his discovery of evolution, most of the theories about human existence were teleological theories, meaning that people theorized about the purpose and they tried to explain the phenomenon in terms of purpose rather than in terms of how and the cause by which we arrived. So in this case, people are trying to talk about more about why we're here and our purpose on this earth rather than how we got here. So, but most of these theories in general, or all these theories for the most part, were based off divine creation. So a lot of them had to do with somehow God had a hand in our creation. And they differed from basically the theory of just the Bible, and Genesis is a creation story theory. And then there's other theories that were really close to Darwin's theory before Darwin actually published The Origin of Species. But like I said, most of them were based off the idea that God created humans. Now, one of the major ideas, and kind of what most people believed, is the great chain of being. That, that animals were in the chain of being, and that we're in the chain of being, but that overall we're the highest up in the chain of being, and that not only are we the highest in this chain of being, but that we are actually not really as connected to the species and all the rest of the animals because we were made in God's image. But that started to all change when Charles Darwin kind of proposed and thought about some new ideas. So when Charles Darwin was 22 years old, he was really studying zoology, and he went on an expedition on the HMS Beagle. Now, this expedition lasted 18 months, or the major part of it lasted 18 months, and what he discovered was that a lot of animals had adaptations that helped them survive. And those adaptations that helped them survive were passed on because they were the fittest to survive, meaning that the adaptations that helped that certain animal survive were passed on because that adaptation itself helped them survive, helped them mate, and therefore pass on that same adaptation to their kids and their kids' kids. So this is the theory that Darwin came up with. That's how he theorized evolution. Now he theorized the same thing even to humans, and the apes had a very similar process over millions and millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, and then eventually we actually just came from apes. And this was with all creatures, like I said. But it mainly specifies with apes, for us at least, because that's what affected us specifically. So he theorized all this and kind of brought this up in what was called The Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. So this theory made some conflicting views within the Victorian era. This wasn't just a scientific theory, which is why it's such a big deal, because it actually made conflicting views within people's ideas, and it was a paradigm shift in a way. For example, before, people could think that humans were designed by an all-powerful God with the purpose of being a good person. Now, after the Origins of Species was published and somebody could have read it, the human purpose could have been no more important than any other animal's purpose because we just came from animals. And how could God have it? And it was like, the idea was that God wouldn't have a hand in that, at least originally. Now, also, sexuality became much more prevalent. Like I said, Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest, the purpose of an animal, is really to pass on their genes. And if a human's purpose is no more important than an animal's, then a human's greatest purpose at that point becomes to pass on their genes. While as before, it was, you must try not to sin and avoid excessive lust. Now, this also challenged ideas of absolute right and wrong. While, man is superior to and made in the being of God, God sets what's right and God sets what's wrong. At this time, people started to realize that what's right and wrong is very cultural, and that each culture had different ideas of what was right and wrong. There's no absolute of either, well, in most cases. So social Darwinism became to be a bigger thing. What social Darwinism really is the idea that we should apply these same ideas and principles in nature into society. That the survival of the fittest and all these ideas could be introduced into society. And that kind of brings about Herbert Spencer, who kind of expands on these ideas, and we'll talk a little more about him, as well as conservative political philosophy, and also brought religious change about. So first we're going to get into Herbert Spencer's ideas. So basically, Herbert Spencer was a biologist and a philosopher of the Victorian era, and he was very prominent. Him and Charles Darwin were very known at this time, and he used Darwin's ideas to justify things like imperialism, racism, and laissez-faire capitalism, and economics and system in general. So basically, starting with laissez-faire capitalism, what it is, it's the idea that you should have an economic system without any government intervention whatsoever, simply supply and demand. So this was the idea that we should be the same as the system is in nature, and that if something isn't needed and nobody needs to buy it, then that place should go bankrupt because they're not providing a service in which people need. And prices are set by supply and demand. If somebody needs something and they're willing to pay this much for it, then that's an okay amount to charge. That's the basic ideas of laissez-faire capitalism, and it's the idea that that the government shouldn't have any interference in that. But like I said, Herbert Spencer also had other ideas, such as pseudoscience and which helped justify imperialism. We see this when he says things like, competition in human society may be ruthless, but it is natural, inevitable, and defensible scientifically. So basically, he's just defending oppression of people through imperialism because of social Darwinism. So we see a couple examples of it, and on the left we see a picture of a Caucasian man's skull, and then an African man's skull, and then a chimpanzee's skull, and they're saying that the similarities between the African man's and the chimpanzee skulls are closer than the Caucasian man's. And a quote from Charles Darwin is, "At some future point, not very distant as measurable by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." So as we see, Charles Darwin kind of held some similar views. The literary Bible of the reading was also in many ways delegitimized because no longer did it show the evolutionary theory. It didn't even talk about it. So therefore, it had a hard time when the evolutionary theory is starting to be proven scientifically. Intelligent design creationism is a new thing that was brought about during this time, and basically this was an adjustment in the church to say that all that evolution is so complex that God had to have a hand in it, and that even if God didn't create us directly, he had a hand in evolution and everything that happened. Also, the church no longer controlled science. We see that back in the 15th, 16th century, the church a lot of times controlled Copernicus and things like that to say that the earth was the center of the world. But now we see here that the church can't challenge these ideas as hard because people are believing them on their own. This also brought up philosophical questions about the soul. People had now asked, do animals have souls if humans ended up coming from animals? And it also set strong atheist beliefs, and there was more atheists that came out of this time. The last thing I'm going to talk about is conservative political theory, which is basically just the idea that big social changes, they don't really happen in that way. That they compare society to the nature, and to animals, and the idea that this change in animals happened over millions and millions of years, and that there can be no large-scale change so quickly. It's only over long periods of time of small change can there actually be any large change in the end at all. And that's my presentation. Thank you.